By the early 1990s, Calvin Klein had already become one of the most powerful fashion brands in America. The campaigns were everywhere. The aesthetic was unmistakable. But inside the company's New York headquarters, the reality was far more controlled than anything the public ever saw. 205 West 39th Street, Manhattan, the middle of the garment district, sometime around 1993. Inside, the walls are white. They are white because a painting crew comes through at night to remove any scuff or fingerprint, so that each morning begins on an unmarked surface. The paper clips are black. The folders are dark gray. The flowers on every reception desk are calla lilies, because the house rule is that flowers are white or they are nothing. The women moving through the halls wear almost no makeup. Their hair is pulled back. Their nails are bare. They carry neat stacks of paper in dark gray folders because they have been taught quietly and consistently that nothing about them should feel excessive. This is Calvin Klein's office at the height of the 1990s. And the story of that decade is not the one you've already heard. To understand what Calvin Klein became in the 1990s, you only need to understand one thing. By the time the decade began, the brand had already reached the top. He started the company in 1968 with $10,000 borrowed from his childhood friend, Barry Schwartz. His first major order came by accident, when a buyer from Bonwit Teller stepped off the elevator on the wrong floor, saw the coats, and placed a $50,000 order. From there, everything accelerated. By the end of the 1970s, he was established. By the 1980s, he was everywhere. A teenage Brooke Shields in Calvin Klein jeans. Fragrance campaigns like Obsession and Eternity that sold emotion before scent. By 1990, Calvin Klein understood something few designers did. He wasn't selling clothing, he was shaping how people wanted to feel. But the culture was shifting. The excess of the 1980s had begun to feel heavy, and Calvin Klein was about to respond. The face was 16 years old in 1990 and living in Croydon. Her name was Kate Moss. She had been scouted 2 years earlier at JFK Airport by the brother of Sarah Dukas, who ran the Storm modeling agency in London. She was 14 at the time. She was small. She was not Amazonian. She had, as Klein would later put it, an edge. In 1990, at 16, she appeared on the cover of the British magazine The Face, photographed on the beach at Camber Sands by her friend Corinne Day, and anyone who was paying attention to the culture of young fashion in that year took note of the cover. Klein's own account of how he found her, given to the press years later, is unvarnished. He had gone to the shows in Paris. He had noticed that every model he had admired was walking for every other designer, and that the sameness had begun to drain the specialness out of them. He wanted someone no one else had yet claimed, someone, as he described it, downtown New York. He mentioned this to the photographer Patrick Demarchelier, and a few weeks later, Demarchelier called. A young woman had just come through the studio. He thought Klein should meet her. The first Calvin Klein photographs of Kate Moss were taken by Demarchelier for the jeans campaign. A contract followed, and in 1992, the brand released a black and white television spot, directed by Herb Ritz, in which Moss stood bare-chested next to the rapper Marky Mark, who wore nothing above the waist and a pair of Calvin Klein briefs below it. The commercial was 70 seconds long. It changed American advertising. What the Marky Mark campaign did was abolish the gloss. The supermodel of the 1980s had been a goddess. She had been 6 feet tall, she had worn Versace, and she had been photographed as if she were a monument. Kate Moss at 17 looked like no monument at all. She looked like your friend's older sister. She did not look like a fantasy. She looked like someone you might actually know. And for an audience exhausted by a decade of spectacle, that felt new. Then, in 1993, came the photograph that fixed the decade's visual grammar. Obsession, the fragrance Klein had launched in 1985, had begun to slip in sales. The head of the fragrance company had told him he needed to do something. What Klein did was send Kate Moss and the young photographer Mario Sorrenti, who happened to be her boyfriend at the time, to an island in the Caribbean, and he told Sorrenti to photograph her the way he actually looked at her. The images came back stripped almost to nothing. A young woman on a white sheet, a young woman curled into a velvet couch, her gaze steady, her skin without artifice, her body neither performing for the camera nor hiding from it. The tagline was a single word: obsession. And for a generation of American consumers who had spent the last decade being sold at, the campaign did not feel like selling. It felt like watching someone be looked at by someone who loved her. The waif aesthetic had entered fashion earlier, through Kate Moss and the British photographers around her. But it was in the mid-1990s that American journalists gave it a harder name, and that label has distorted the record ever since. It is worth saying clearly what the aesthetic actually was. It was a photographic look: pale skin, thin bodies, apparent lassitude. It was aimed most of all at the Corinne Day editorials in British Vogue and at the Mario Sorrenti photographs that followed them. Klein's 1993 Obsession campaign, shot by Sorrenti, was adjacent to that aesthetic but not identical to it. The Sorrenti Obsession photographs, if you look at them now, are patient and quiet and attentive. They are not degraded, they are not drugged, they are love letters. What that phrase obscured was something much simpler. The visual language Calvin Klein introduced in the early 1990s was not really about shock. It was the deliberate removal of everything the 1980s had piled on, down to the last bracelet, and the rediscovery of what a face could do when a face was allowed to be a face. By the mid-1990s, the aesthetic had moved beyond fashion. It had become culture. In 1994, Calvin Klein did the thing every major fashion house does at some point in its life. It stopped speaking only to the people who already loved it, and it began to speak to everyone. The vehicle was a fragrance called CK1, and it arrived in the fall of that year. It was sold in a frosted glass bottle that looked like a flask. It was priced like a drugstore perfume. It was the first mass unisex fragrance in American history, and the campaign that launched it, photographed by Steven Meisel, was a black and white group portrait of young people who did not look like the young people in most fragrance campaigns. Meisel cast, among others, Kate Moss, who by now was the face of the brand. He also cast Jenny Shimizu, a Japanese-American former mechanic with a buzz cut and visible tattoos, whom nobody in American fashion advertising had yet thought to put in a national campaign. He cast the young actor Donovan Leitch. He cast several other faces whose names the mainstream did not yet know. He lined them up against a white wall. He dressed them in the kind of clothes a young person might actually wear on a day that was not special, and he photographed them talking to each other. For the first time, a luxury advertisement looked less like fantasy and more like a scene from an MTV green room, and a generation of American teenagers who had spent most of their adolescence watching Nirvana videos and reading Sassy magazine and slowly working out that the culture their parents had handed them was not quite the culture they wanted, saw themselves reflected in a luxury product. They recognized the reflection, and they spent their money accordingly. CK1 sold in the millions of bottles in its first months on the shelf. It became, by the end of the decade, among the best-selling prestige fragrances of the 1990s. More than that, it did something to the brand itself. It suggested that Calvin Klein was no longer a single voice, but a whole register, capable of speaking at the volume of a luxury fashion house and at the volume of a high school hallway in the same breath. The Meisel campaign was not the only cultural moment of that year. In the summer of 1995, Klein released a jeans campaign, also shot by Meisel, in which very young-looking models were photographed in wood-paneled rooms in poses that were widely described at the time as uncomfortable. The campaign was pulled within weeks. the Justice Department opened an inquiry and then closed it without finding a violation. Klein issued a public statement in which he defended the artistic intent while acknowledging that the execution had missed. The episode is not the whole story of 1995 at Calvin Klein, but it is part of the story, and no honest account of the decade leaves it out. What the 1995 controversy revealed, more than anything else, was the edge the brand had always been walking. Klein had built the house on an idea of provocation that depended on restraint, and for one season the balance had tipped. It was the first time in the decade that restraint had not won, and yet the broader cultural moment held. By the middle of 1995, Calvin Klein was what only a handful of brands manage. For a very short window to be, it was the thing every other brand was trying to look like. The minimalism that had begun with Kate Moss on a white sheet had spread everywhere. The interiors magazines were suddenly full of white walls. Restaurants were tearing out their carpeting and putting down concrete. American weddings began to feature bias-cut silk slip dresses instead of cathedral gowns. The aesthetic had escaped the building at 205 West 39th, and it had gone wherever it wanted to go. And inside that building, meanwhile, a woman named Caroline Bessette had been walking through the halls every morning for 6 years. By 1994, she was in charge of the department that told the world what Calvin Klein meant. Inside the building, that culture looked even more controlled. Caroline Bessette had grown up in Greenwich, Connecticut. She was the youngest of 3 daughters of an architectural engineer and a New York City public school administrator. She had gone to Boston University, where she majored in elementary education and, in the spring of her graduating year, appeared on a Girls of BU calendar. She had briefly done publicity for a few Boston nightclubs, and then, mostly because she needed a job, she had taken a position behind the counter at the Calvin Klein shop at the Chestnut Hill Mall in Newton. A traveling sales coordinator from the company's New York office passed through the store one afternoon and noticed her. A recommendation was made to Susan Sokol, the president of Calvin Klein Collection. Sokol flew Caroline down for an interview. She later told the New York Times that Caroline fit the bill perfectly, that she was absolutely charming, completely refreshing, completely outgoing. A job was offered. Caroline took it. She was 23 years old. What she did in her first years in New York was sell. She was placed at the flagship showroom and assigned to the celebrity clients, and the celebrity clients adored her. She dressed Annette Bening. She dressed Diane Sawyer. Paul Wilmot, who worked alongside her in the publicity department, would later say that she had sold millions of dollars of clothes. She would walk a client through the collection, he said, and tell her what looked good and show her how it all went together. She had a particular gift for this work that is worth naming, because it explains why she rose as quickly as she did. She understood that clothes told you something about the person wearing them, and she had the rare ability to see the person and the object at once. She did not oversell. She knew when to leave a woman alone in a fitting room. By the early 1990s, she had moved into publicity itself. By 1994, she was director of publicity for the collection. Eventually, she became director of show productions, which meant she ran the runway shows, and when she left the company in the spring of 1996, she was earning a salary in the low 6 figures, which was, for a woman under 30 in fashion publicity in that decade, substantial. She worked in a building whose rules she had internalized completely, possibly because the rules described a woman very close to who she already was. The walls were white. The hangers were black. The flowers were calla lilies. The makeup was minimal. Nail polish was not worn. Eyebrows were thin. Hair was pulled back. Jewelry, if worn at all, was simple enough that no one would ask you to take it off. The phrase a former employee would later use, speaking about the late-decade version of the office culture, was that everyone's makeup looked like Caroline's. The sequence may have run in the other direction. It is possible that Caroline's makeup had looked like that first, and that the women around her had learned from her. She smoked constantly. Most of them did. A mild haze of cigarette smoke sat over the 39th Street offices all day, caught in the slats of the wooden blinds, layered into the white paint. One of the interns from those years, a woman named Mary Beth Kelly, who came to the company from Mount Holyoke in 1994, would remember decades later that Carolyne had stopped at her desk one afternoon to bum a cigarette off her. Kelly also remembered watching Kate Moss walk past her desk on another day. She remembered the office as electric and glamorous, and she remembered that no one inside it knew, at the time, that they were living through anything historic. They were, she said, just trying to keep up with the business. The hours were long. Employees arrived at 6 or 7 in the morning and stayed until 9 at night. Klein himself, according to one woman who worked on the international side, would pace the halls looking at designs at midnight. Most of the staff did not speak to him. The unwritten rule, observed in these rooms for decades, was that you did your work and you stayed out of his way. Carolyne was one of the very few who was allowed past the rule. She spoke to him. She advised him. By some accounts, the friendship was genuinely close. She also, in those halls, became close to a young designer named Narciso Rodriguez, who was then working at Calvin Klein before he had yet made a name under his own. He would design her wedding dress. In the spring of 1996, she resigned. She was engaged to John Kennedy Jr., whom she had met several years earlier at the showroom, in a story that has been told in several different versions and whose details have hardened in the telling. John was preparing to launch George, the political magazine, and Carolyne had already begun to work on the launch without credit. A close friend would later tell people that she was simply ready to move on. In March, she walked out of the building at 205 West 39th for the last time. She was 30 years old. She would be married in 6 months, but by the end of the decade, something had begun to shift. The Calvin Klein brand did not stop in the spring of 1996. It could not. The decade had another 3.5 years to run, and the house had to keep speaking, and for a while it did. CKB launched in the fall of 1996, the third and final entry in the unisex fragrance series. The campaign was softer than CK1 had been, less defiant, more interior. The tagline was a single word: B. The bottle was matte. The advertising, again shot by Steven Meisel, felt like an echo of the 1995 group portraits, except that the young people had grown slightly older and slightly quieter. Something in the room had changed. The campaigns of the late decade kept trying to catch the lightning the house had caught in 1993. Some of them came close. Most of them did not. The 1997 and 1998 collection campaigns, shot by various photographers, have a kind of beautiful exhaustion to them. The clothes were still minimal. The models were still thin, but the culture had begun to move on. By 1998, the minimalism that had ruled the first half of the decade was softening into what the magazines would call, with some embarrassment, Y2K futurism. By 1999, the industry around Klein was also changing. Gabriella Forte, the former Armani executive who had taken over as president in 1994, left the company before the decade was out. Narciso Rodriguez, who had designed Carolyne's wedding dress in the fall of 1996, became a star of his own in the years that followed, and left to run his own label. The brand's center of gravity had begun to shift from the design studio toward the licensing division, a quiet but decisive change that would shape everything the house became in the following decade. In the summer of 1999, the plane went down. Carolyne and John and her sister Lauren died on a clear July night off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. The whole country, for a few weeks, looked again at Calvin Klein photographs, because every photograph of Carolyne, in some sense, was also a photograph of the decade she had helped define. 4 years later, in 2003, Klein and Schwartz sold the company to Philips Van Heusen. The sale was worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $700 million. Klein stayed on as a consultant for a few years and then walked away. The building at 205 West 39th went on without him. The walls kept being painted white at night. The flowers on the reception desks remained calla lilies. But the decade in which all of those details had meant something particular, in which they had added up to a single continuous sentence the brand was trying to say, had ended. What 90s Calvin Klein really was, stripped of everything else, was a belief. The decade ended. The culture changed.
Thank you everyone so much for watching Cultured Elegance. If you'd love to support the channel, you can become a channel member today by clicking Join at the bottom of the screen. Thank you everyone so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.